Phones are all off.
Well, good evening and welcome to another Monday night Q&A session. We trust you're all well and safe, and are looking forward to another informative evening. Tonight I'm joined by Dean Kinsella. So, hello, Dean.
Evening, Sam. How you doing?
Yeah.
Evening, everybody else. See you all again.
Yeah. How's your day been so far?
It's been a good day today, Sam. No assessments today, so I've been doing plenty of CPD. I'm not sure if many people know what CPD is, but it's continual professional development. So it's self-development. Been looking at a few courses, read a few technical articles, just trying to keep up to speed with the ever-flowing advancements in the industry and trying to keep up with my contractors as well.
Yeah, I think we've, one of the reasons why we're in this industry is we've got that inquisitive gene. We like to know things and we like to know how things work and how things are done. But on the flip side of that, we're in a very fast changing industry that never ends. We've got electric vehicles now, we've got battery storage coming on, we've got lots of green energy options. There's always something. You can never say that's it, I've learnt it all now, because something else will be coming around the corner.
Every day's a school day, Sam.
Every day's a school day. Yeah, it's very, very, very true, and it's good. It's good because once we get over that hurt pride of not knowing the answer straight away, we do our research, we find out, and then we're waiting for the person to ask us the same question again, so that we've got it.
Yeah. So it's my school day today.
Very good. Okay, well we've got a few people in the virtual room, so we'll kick off. Question of the week that we posted was, when on a new installation or when changing a consumer unit, how much spare capacity do I need to leave to comply with BS 7671? So what's your thoughts on that question, Dean?
Well, if I'm going to go with the industry, Sam, I would say the majority of people are going to say 20%, maybe 2 ways on each side of the dual RCD board.
But
that's not the case, though, is it?
No, I was going to say, is that a requirement, a 7671?
No, I think that's more of just a myth within the industry, to be honest. Actually, there's no requirement within BS 7671. What you're looking at more is probably a contractual agreement with the clients, obviously scope of works, future-proofing, discussing with the clients if they're going to have an extensions built, any additional electrical circuits installed, EV charging, as discussed earlier, PV and so forth. So no, there's no requirement BS 7671, more or less a good practice, more as a requirement.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things that we were sort of always taught as we were developing, and we learnt that, and perhaps considered good practice. But as you say, it's not actually a requirement of 7671 to provide any spare capacity. It's often driven by a contractual requirement, so your customer specifies it in the contract, or maybe it's part of their technical standard, so they want you to leave 20% or 2 circuits, whichever is the smaller. So, but yeah, it's not actually a requirement. So for example, if you had a completely full board that you were upgrading for one reason or another, you could consider just upgrading it on a like-for-like basis with the same number of ways. But yeah, it might be advisable to have a conversation with the customer to see if they are likely to want any spare capacity in the future, but it's not actually a requirement of 7671. So
Now, but what I would like to add on to that, Sam, before we conclude on that side of things, is also bear in mind that if you're doing a like for like on a fuse board, that there might be some of the circuits may have been doubled up. So obviously the contractor has to be mindful of doing some checks before they take on the project. Maybe have a look and see what circuits there are, check how many conductors are in each circuit, try and get a good understanding of installation. Last thing they want is to do a like for like and then find that they've got 1, 2, 3 or 4 circuits doubled up, and then they've made the installation, I wouldn't say no much more better, but they haven't helped give a scope of work for future proofing.
yeah, very good point. So if the if the existing installation hasn't got a good division of installation to minimise the impact of a single fault, then yeah, perhaps you're going to need to supply additional ways, because 7671 does tell us that each circuit should have its own way in the board. So yeah, very good. And as somebody's mentioned in the chat room, EICR before changing the board is always a recommended approach. So
Yeah.
very good point made by yourself and by a colleague in the chat room there. So that's good.
Best practice guide 1. Good one to refer to.
Yeah, best practice guide 1 has got some very good information about consumer unit changes. Another question we had that's been floating around, although we didn't publicise it on social media, is having installed a new electric vehicle charging point, what's the recommended interval to the first periodic inspection for that new circuit that should be recorded on the electrical installation certificate? So if I take that one, so generally we would always suggest following manufacturer's instructions. So the first one would be to have a look at the electric vehicle charging manufacturer to see if they've got any specific guidance on the period to the first inspection. Outside of that, we would generally say that in the absence of any specific instructions, that it would be reasonable to inspect and test the EV charging circuit at the same interval as the rest of the installation from which it's being supplied. So for example, if it was a new build domestic owner occupied property, you might consider the 10 years of the new build. If it was rented, 5 years, and likewise if it's commercial or industrial, follow those standard timescales. So really go by, unless there are manufacturer's instructions that tell you otherwise, go by the recommended inspection interval for the installation that's supplying the vehicle charging point. Would you add anything to that, Dean?
Yeah, just a small point. Obviously, the only other consideration I can think of is our environmental conditions as well. Whether it be domestic, commercial or industrial, depending on the location of the actual EV charging point, might be different than other parts of the installation which is connected to. And the environmental conditions may kind of warrant the need to do a periodic inspection, maybe that part of installation more frequently than other parts of the installation that's connected to.
We've got an accompanying question to that. So this question come in: if my property's earthing arrangement is TT, do I need to put my EV supply on an Rcbo even though the unit has built-in RCD protection? So because it's TT, it's highly unlikely that you're not going to be able to meet the maximum ZS of a breaker or a fuse. So in those instances where you've got a high income impedance associated with the earth electrode, generally the only way you're going to achieve disconnection by meeting the ZS of the protective device is to use an RCD. So typically on a TT you're going to need RCD protection on the circuit supplying the vehicle charging equipment, even though, as you say, the vehicle charging equipment could have its own inbuilt RCD. What you then need to consider is the inbuilt one, looking at the vehicle charging outlet, will need to be 30 milliamp to comply with 7671, and therefore to give you discrimination, as we call it, or selectivity, as we call it now, you need to think about perhaps making that one protecting the circuit 100 milliamp time delayed to give you enough discrimination with the 30 milliamp device in the charging equipment. So again, you've got to make sure that your cable now supplying it doesn't need itself 30 milliamp. So don't bury it in the wall less than 50 mil unless it's mechanically protected. So an example could be perhaps use SWA to supply the vehicle charging equipment, earth the SWA so it doesn't need 30 milliamp, and then put 100 milliamp time delayed on the TT supply to the vehicle charging, and that will give you selectivity with the 30 milliamp in the charger. Anything else you'd add to that, Dean?
With regards to installation, Sam, no. I was just thinking more on the lines of certification. The fact that the contract would need to tick the box, RCDs for fault protection.
Yeah, very good point. On TTs,
yeah.
that's generally so. On TT system, it's going to be there for fault protection as well as providing additional where needed. Unless, of course, you've got one of those situations where you've got structural steel in the building that you can rely on, that's giving you a nice low resistance, and then you can rely on a standard overcurrent protective device. The regs do allow us to do that, where that low resistance is durable and maintainable. So hopefully that answers that.
Just one more thing on the certification side, Sam. We'll make sure the contractor puts the information in the other Part 7 special installations or locations section of the items of schedule inspected.
Yeah, because it is a vehicle charging circuit, which is special locations. Yeah. Okay, another one that we've had come in. If I install an additional new socket in an existing domestic installation, do I need to comply with the requirements of Part M for the building regs for the height of the socket from the floor? Okay, so that's Part M's about providing people with limited reach to give them access to controls and equipment. So if we add a socket into an existing domestic installation, Dean, do we need to comply with Part M requirements?
No, there's no requirements to comply with Part M. If it's an existing part of the building, what you have got to consider, Part M generally talks about where the existing building has undergone structural change, and the socket in question is within that particular part of the building, which is part of the structure change. Then the contractor would have to refer to approved document Part M to go within the height for that particular accessory or piece of equipment.
Yeah, but in principle, if we're just talking about electrical additions and alterations and there's no structural, then we don't need to comply with Part M, and we can maintain the existing heights. Yeah.
Yeah, so as an example, obviously looking at extensions, wraparounds, so on and so forth, where you would have to consider working with approved document Part M. Yeah.
I think a good rule of thumb is if building control are involved, so they're materially altering the structure of the building, you know, even it might only be that they're knocking down an internal wall, they're creating a new bathroom or a new kitchen that was previously something else. If building control are involved, then you will need to comply with building regs. If you've got any any doubt, by all means give the local authority building control a call. Just get their confirmation. That it's sometimes always better to get their confirmation before going ahead, because it's often difficult to get it afterwards. So yeah, always check. But typically, unless building control are involved, you don't need to comply with building regs, because although you're doing electrical additions and alterations, you're not affecting the material structure of the building.
And again, just to add on to that one, there's other approved documents that are available where there might be a need to refer to them with regards to other aspects of the electrical work within different parts of the new installation, as in the fabric of the building as well, ventilation, fire detection, passage of sound, so on and so forth. So again, consult with your local building control department on that if they're involved in it.
Okay, we've got one in the chat room that I can see. Whilst carrying out an EICR and the insulation resistance for a circuit is 20 megohms, how long would you recommend for the next inspection? I know it's engineering judgment. I would normally recommend 2 or 3 years depending upon the condition of the installation, but that 20 megohms will probably be fine well over 5 years. Difficult one to give a finite answer for, because it's very dependent upon what was the last measurement and how long ago. So for example, if it was 20 megs 5 years ago, and 20 meg 5 years before that, then you would say that, well, that's not showing any deterioration. So it does very much depend. If it was a brand new installation and we were only getting 20 megs, you know, you wouldn't feel comfortable about giving its full 10 years or 5 years depending upon the use of the property. But yeah, there's no fast and hard rules on, you know, if the value is this, the years is this, because it depends on the deterioration from the past. So, you know, if you've only installed that 5 years ago, and 5 years ago it was off the scale, you know, 999, then you definitely wouldn't be thinking about another 5 years, because that's a hell of a drop in a short period of time. So it really does factor in based on how much it's dropped over what time, and what's the possible cause of that drop. You know, are we talking about an outdoor circuit that could have been showing signs of water ingress, for example? Tying it in with the previous question, have there been material alterations and additions to the circuit that might have caused some cable damage? So yeah, think of those things. But yeah, there's no hard and fast rule. It'd be great if there was, but there isn't. It's very dependent upon the actual installation and the changes that have happened in it.
Yeah, I would add on to that and just say again, make a record on your report when you put the interval in there. Give a reason for the recommendation as well, so it's in black and white, and maybe have a discussion with the client. A lot of clients may expect to see the maximum recommended inspection interval, and this might be reduced because of various factors. Just speak to the client and make them aware of the reason why why you've reduced the time interval from what they expect it to be.
Yeah, absolutely. Another one that we'll talk about, not so much a real technical question, but someone's just mentioned that generally the belief is that BSI only allowed 2 amendments to any British standard. They let this lapse with the 17th when there was a 3rd amendment, but would not do it again. Does this mean once we have the 2nd amendment on the 18th, we will need to go to another edition, i.e. the 19th, then all go back to college and exam again? Yeah, it's a common question that gets up. You're right in that typically, you know, if you go back on the history on the inside of the regs book, you can see the various editions. It tends to be the norm that they try and give a decent amount of time in between changes, but then things happen. So, you know, a classic example would be Amendment 1, when new protective devices were introduced for vehicle charging. So it does very much sometimes depend on new technology that's come out. So yeah, that warranted an Amendment 1, which I don't think was originally planned when the 18th was brought out. So it's not a strict rule, but yeah, typically they try and stick to 2 editions before there's a major change, and then the revision is updated as it would be from 18th to 19th. So we're aware at the moment they are working through all of the comments that were made to the document for public comment, and I think the planned timescale of the Amendment 2 publication is 2023. Was it 2023, 2022? I'd have to check that. I know it's not this year, 2022. But was it April 2022? Seems to ring a bell. March, April. March. Yeah. So that's the plan, and then yeah, as you've said, normally then that would be a 5-year cycle from the 18th edition to the 19th edition, roughly. But yeah, it does depend very much on what product developments, what electrical installation requirement developments there are. So, you know, if things changed again round another one of the special areas, for example, as much as they have round vehicle charging, then that might warrant a further amendment before it's updated to 19th. So no hard and fast rules.
The thing to note on the changes, Sam, just very quickly, is changes are brought in to heighten safety. So although a change can introduce financial impact, it is there to reduce risk. So I know a lot of people don't like change, and it happens more frequently, and a lot of contractors in the industry believe it's down to a money-making exercise. Of course, some parts of the industry will make money from it if they are involved in training and publications and so on and so forth. But primarily, the change is there for increased safety.
Yeah.
Nothing more, nothing less. So change is good. It's evolution. So.
Okay. We've got a question that's come in asking us about, with regards to old fuse boards, and that's in brackets skeleton mantell boards that are in council properties. So these were very common, in particular in blocks of flats, for example. Do you still need the door on its hinges, or is this a failure on an EICR? So a little bit. I would suggest on an EICR you've got to have the enclosure maintaining adequate barrier and enclosure protection. So you know we shouldn't have access to any live parts. So depending upon if the cover it still provides that degree of protection without the hinged door. So if the door just covers up the access to the breakers, switches, control gear on the front, then providing you've still got adequate barrier and enclosure protection, I wouldn't see it as a failure on an EICR, because obviously EICR, once again, we're looking at safety for continued use for the users of the installation. Anything you'd add on that, Dean?
No, except I suppose consideration to whether the internal sort of barriers behind the door as a part of the mantel are manufactured, or whether they've been fabricated by a previous engineer or not, may not offer the right form of IP protection for the fuse board and its surrounding areas. So again, that's where on a periodic you're looking for the person to be competent, obviously have experience with regards to different installations, different equipment and accessories and switchgear, to draw some sort of conclusion as to whether behind that door, or the door not being there, you are going to reduce the risk of electric shock, immediate danger or potential danger. So it's not a straight answer, as you say. You'd need more information to draw judgment with regards to experience on what's actually fitted
Yeah.
within that entail unit, so to speak.
Yeah, but I think if we're talking about the consumer unit or distribution board itself, providing we've still got adequate barrier and enclosure protection, we wouldn't see it as a fail. There may be other reasons. So you know, if it's not got RCD protection where it's required, for example, but the distribution board itself, not considered a fail unless we've got access to live parts. How long would you recommend for the next inspection to rented and owned property? New Rcbo, RCD board change on an EICR. So if we've got a new board, it would depend very much on the final circuit. So often it's not just the board that's showing signs of wear and tear. It can be the installation wiring as well. So the guidance we give really is based on new installation. So a new owner occupied property would suggest a maximum of 10 years to the first inspection. A new rented property would recommend 5 years, and that's to give some kind of indication on the degree of care and regular maintenance that's generally given. So with it being owner occupied, perhaps you would like to think that the owners are going to take better care of it and look after it, hence the 10 years compared to rented property. But that's based on brand new. You've got to be very careful if you just change the board. That will provide enhancements, but it won't necessarily give you the full life back, because obviously the deterioration also includes the deterioration of your final circuits, in particular the wiring, and in particular the insulation resistance associated with the wiring. So just changing the board does not automatically give you the 10 years and the 5 years back. Anything else you'd add to that, Dean?
Yeah, I suppose it depends on other values of the testing and the inspection as well that you mentioned just quickly, the IR values, the continuity values. Is a previous installation certificate being provided for the fuse board change so you can compare readings or not? I guess there's different factors to consider to tie in with the recommendations as per guidance note 3 as to whether you give it a 5, a 10, or somewhere in between that interval. So it's not, as you said, Sam, it's not a straightforward 5 or 10. There's other factors to consider as well. So.
Okay, let's just have a look. If a customer wants switches and fuse boards at heights not to regulation in a domestic dwelling, can we install to their specifications? So if providing we're not talking about a building inspector role, so you know we've not materially altered the structure of the building, we've not changed its use, so we're just talking about perhaps a rewire, only electrical additions and alterations, then there's no specified height to meet, other than we need to ensure that things are accessible, especially if we're using devices as a means of isolation. So if our only means of isolation for those hazardous appliances and hazardous circuits is the consumer unit or distribution board, then it needs to be readily accessible to prevent that hazard in the situation where we require to isolate. Other than that, there's no fixed heights. The heights really came in with Part M, and Part M, as we've talked about, is for new build, is for where we've materially altered the structure of the building or we've changed its use. So, you know, perhaps if you went from shop to domestic, you might not do any material alteration because that's a different use, then building control are once again involved. And And if we have a look, so I think we've got some follow-on questions. If a metal consumer unit is missing its metal drop-down lid, does this affect the quality of the non-combustible material, meaning its fire protecting integrity? If so, what code? I think that's one for the manufacturer of the consumer unit, because they also need to consider, you know, if it is a flip up, a drop down. If it's drop down, then, you know, when you've got the breakers exposed, does it still comply? So in general, it's more than likely that it won't affect the combustible, because that was really to do with the enclosure spreading fire. So that was the potential hazard with plastic consumer units. Heat generated within, perhaps from a loose connection, would result in the plastic getting so hot eventually it melted, and transferred that heat energy then onto combustible material. So providing the manufacturer of the industry of the item of equipment has considered those variations. And also we have got to think about, well, you know, often we get the exposed bank of breakers which isn't covered up, and that's still deemed by the manufacturer, and he's had it tested to make sure it complies with the non-combustible requirements. So in general, it's okay, but just check with the manufacturer to get that confirmation. And let's see if we can pick another one up very quickly. It's been asked to do an EICR on a farmhouse. The farmhouse comes under the PRS, but the farm out buildings are fed from the same supply as the farmhouse. Would you just note in the EICR which parts have been tested and omit the parts that come under agricultural? The landlord only wants to comply with PRS. Yeah, you know, you can. That's the point of clearly detailing the extent of the installation covered by the report. So there's nothing that says you have to do the entire installation. You know, so long as you clearly record what you've covered, but consider if there are any potential hazards that could come back. You know, I'm thinking about close proximity of those outbuildings, which could then have an effect in terms of fire rating of consumer units, perhaps, for example. So give it some consideration. But yeah, it's perfectly acceptable to just limit it to one building, even though there may be several outbuildings also associated that are on the same supply and therefore considered part of the same installation. Would you agree with that, Dean?
Yeah, totally what you're saying, Sam. Again, just making a record in the extent of limitations section of the report, make it quite clear which part of the installation the installation is being covered by the report. Make it very clear on there, so the client's aware of it, and anybody else that receives the report, i.e. the local council, is also aware of it as well. Yeah.
Okay. And we'll just take one more that I've seen come in, because it's a great question that we were actually talking about off camera before the start. So you've got a water incoming in plastic, and it's been bonded above the stopcock. Would you remove the bond if it's not required? So what are your thoughts on that one, Dean?
Yeah, cut it off, throw it away. Be done with it. It only gets in the way. It's unsightly, aesthetically unpleasing. No, as you and I discussed off camera, there's more to it. Obviously, the contractor or the inspector, whoever's there at the time, has to confirm whether that particular part of the installation is deemed to be extraneous conductive parts or not. So a visual only sometimes is not sufficient enough. Just because it's accessible, just because it's copper, doesn't always mean it's extraneous. Further tests are required to determine whether the metallic parts are in fact extraneous. Guidance Note 8, earthing and bonding, makes good reference to that. talks about the electric shock, the different resistance values that you're trying to achieve, the minimum to the maximum. So going back to what you're saying, it's not black and white. Further investigation would be required.
And
whether the building is large enough to have that metallic pipework going back into what we perceive to be ground again as it comes out other parts of the building. So testing would need to be done.
yeah, I think we need to confirm that it's not extraneous and therefore doesn't need bonding. What about we talked about? It might be worth explaining what's the potential hazard of bonding something that doesn't need to be bonded.
Yeah, so obviously on the flip side, sometimes given the installation, and this will be different for all installations, by bonding where the pipe work in question is not extraneous, can introduce a potential. So you can make the installation unsafer as opposed to not having the bonding in place. So it can work both ways,
Yeah.
to be fair, yeah.
Yeah. So
again, in consideration.
Absolutely. The whole idea of bonding something is to maintain that equipotential zone, but sometimes by bonding something that doesn't need bonding, now we can actually get some potentials on that bit of isolated pipework that would never have had any potentials before. So yeah, we can make things worse by bonding something that doesn't need to be. So it's wrong to just think, well, I can't do any harm by bonding it, so I'll bond it anyway. We would advise against it. Only bond it if it actually needs to be bonded. So you've confirmed that it is extraneous, and there are some tests that you can do to confirm that if you can't 100% confirm it visually. Okay, we're going to wrap it up there because we need to make a couple of announcements. It's almost like we've got a good news, bad news. So we'll do the good news first. Good news is we've got another one of our Wednesday webinars in the Wire series this Wednesday. So that's Wednesday the 10th. Of February. Difference being that you need to register for that. If you want to watch it live, you need to register in advance. Of course, you can still watch them on demand in your own time afterwards, but it's always good to watch them live and then perhaps get your questions answered there and then. So that's this Wednesday at 8 o'clock. If you go onto the website, you'll get instructions of how to register for it. So that's the good news, and I know that the last webinar that took place about 2 weeks ago was very well attended. I think we had something like 800 people watching it, which was fantastic. So this one will be just as good. The bad news is we're not going to have a Monday night next week. It's half term, and so we've got some holidays between us. So there won't be any Monday night Q&A session next Monday. That's the 15th, but we'll be returning again the following Monday, Monday the 22nd. So without too much more, thanks very much for listening, and again really appreciate you taking part in pushing your questions forward and commenting on the questions that we're talking about. It's really good to see. And we'll see you again. If we don't see you on Wednesday, we'll see you on the 22nd. So that's good night for me and Dean.
Yeah, good night, gentlemen. Keep up the good work. Thanks for your time, Stephen, Sam. Everybody be safe.
Okay.
Have a nice evening. Goodbye.
Cheers. Night.